Um, so on behalf of the members and friends of First Congregational Church and my colleague, the Reverend Laura Kistart, who's sitting here in the front, it is a tremendous joy to welcome you to this historic meeting house right in the center of Southington. It's a place where, as we say every Sunday, no matter who you are or where you are on life's journey, you are welcome here. I'm Ron Brown, and it is a great honor to serve as the senior pastor of this church for almost the last 12 years. Now, this community of faith here in this church has really been at the center of Southington for nearly 300 years. This building where we're gathering has watched over the town green for nearly the last 200 years. So some may think we are old, and some of us are, but our thinking isn't. And we are constantly looking for new ways to engage people and faith in new and exciting ways for this scary world that we are living in right now. I often remind people who attend worship in this meeting house that our ancestors put clear glass windows in this building, and I think that was intentional. So we have to look outside. Stained glass does not block our view. We can only be the church God calls us to be when we look out the windows and see the people who are out there, whom we need to be whom we need to serve. So this lecture, I want to tell you just a little bit about. First Congregational Church established the Milton and Catherine Chaffee Lecture on the Future of the Church, using funds from a bequest by Catherine Chaffee when she died in 2011. Mrs. Chaffee was a woman ahead of her time. Born in 1917, she was an independent woman. She lived alone in the city of Hartford, loved to travel, was very active in her church, and thought nothing of walking alone on city streets to go to the market, even at night. She, and I can tell you this from experience, she enjoyed a good joke, a hearty laugh, and a well-told story. And Kay was a person of deep faith. She married for the first time when she was 61 years old. And after her death, as I said, the church honored her and her late husband, Milton, by naming a lecture series in their memory. So the Reverend John Dorhauer, who is still the general minister and president of the United Church of Christ, he delivered the first Chaffee lecture in April of 2018. Our intention is to do it every other year, and of course in 2020 it was canceled. So it's also a great honor to introduce this year's lecturers, the Reverend Molly Baskett and Dr. Ellen O'Donnell. Molly is a UCC pastor, now serving in Berkeley, California, but she spent the first 45 years of her life here in the Southern New England Conference. As a kid at Broadview Community Church in Hartford, a staff member of Silver Lake in Sharon, Connecticut, which is, I think, where Molly and I met some years ago, and later as a pastor in Beverly, Massachusetts, and Somerville, Massachusetts. She's authored a book called Real Good Church, How Our Church Came Back from the Dead, and yours can too. Highly recommend it. Excellent book. And a new book, How to Begin When Your World is Ending, a spiritual field guide to joy despite everything, which says here in the note she sent me out November 15th, but there are books right up here, so they're already out. You get a head start on them. Ellen O'Donnell is a pediatric psychologist at Mass General for Children, a writer, a mama, and a person with type 1 diabetes. She loves to talk and write about living well with chronic illness and parenting, both of which she has lots of experience with, but claims no expertise. So she and Molly met when Ellen brought her now college student son, Luke, to First Church in Somerville when Molly was pastor there as a newborn in a sling. They bonded through the early vicissitudes of parenting, their backstages accidentally showing on the early morning daycare carpool, and turned their work in progress parenting into a book that helped countless others navigate the hard and holy task of child rearing. The book they produced, Bless This Mess, A Modern Guide to Faith and Parenting in a Chaotic World, is about the intersection of spirituality and the science of child development, how the pandemic has shaped what growing up means, doing real harm to children and teens, as well as creating new possibilities, and how to be good enough parents, grandparents, chosen family, and churches raising good enough kids in a turbulent world. You'll be able to greet Molly and Ellen after the lecture downstairs in Memorial Hall, and you'll also be able to look at and purchase their books. Get there by going through the doors behind me. You go down the hallway to the left. About halfway down, there's a stairwell you can take to the ground floor or an elevator at the end of the hall. So Molly and Ellen, we're so thrilled to be able to welcome you to Southington, and we very much look forward to what you have to say. Molly delivered an excellent sermon this morning, so you can watch that online if you want on our Facebook page.
You're just saying that because I praised Ron in it. That's right. The whole first 5 minutes. Thank you, everybody. It's so thrilling to be here and see so many old friends and meet some new ones. It's really delightful. And this is going to be more conversation between us than lecture, and we'll open up to you at some point. We have a few guiding questions for you, and then anything you want to ask us, anything we want to open up together. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So Ron told a little bit of the book's origin story. We can dive a little deeper in terms of where it came from. I was parent to strong-willed Rafe, who was 2 years older than Ellen's oldest, Luke. And as Ron said, we were not only part of the same church, but part of the same daycare carpool, and saw a lot of each other's struggles in parenting. And I found myself turning to Ellen for advice because she was an excellent budding child psychologist. And she turned to me as her pastor for spiritual support. And then we started thinking maybe other people could benefit from this marriage of science and spirituality, because I think most, if not all of us in the room are UCC, and we understand those things to be not inimical to one another, but a lot of secular people give side eye to faith, and a lot of religious people give side eye to science, and they work best in harmony, right, when we can harmonize them. And one other piece I want to lift up, because I'm afraid I'll forget it if I don't say it later. A big piece that I think is really applicable to this post-pandemic moment, if we can even say we're post-pandemic, late pandemic, whatever it is.
New normal.
We didn't know we would be heading into a pandemic when we wrote the book. It came out about 6 months before the pandemic started. But we really wanted to empower parents and grandparents and caregivers to be their children's first and primary spiritual teacher. Because a lot of people don't feel up to the task, so they outsource it to the paid professionals, the pastors, the CE directors, the youth ministers, and it's wonderful to have those kinds of people in your children's life and world. But the fact of the matter is, you know them best, you spend the most time with them, you are the one they trust. And just in the way that parents are kind of children's first God, they're also their first God teacher, their first and last and middle teacher about God. So we hope to kind of reverse engineer what we had learned to give it to parents and other caregivers in an easily digestible form. You know, there's ages and stages at the end of each chapter, so that they felt comfortable and empowered to really bring spirituality into the home. And particularly now, I know at my church, I serve a kind of a mid-sized church. We're about 350 members. At first, we were all online, like all churches. Came back in October, went back to online in January, and we found that young families weren't coming back. So we stopped, we had online Sunday school, and then we stopped doing any of that. And now, all of a sudden, we have all these kids in church. We have our old families who finally come back, and we have a whole bunch of new families, which is really wonderful. But we don't have the infrastructure that we used to for Sunday school. And you know what? Like, there's a part of me that quivers thinking about that, because I'm, there's still that people pleaser in me that's like, oh, I need to give you what I think you need. But Their kids are present with parents in worship. We've figured out other workarounds, and everyone's fine with that. And we have 40 or 50 years of research into Sunday school now that shows us that it does not actually form our children in the faith, and it does not keep them in the church when they're adults. What does keep them in church or with some kind of active faith is being present in worship, being given roles in leadership in worship because then they feel part of things, relationships with other adults in the church beside their parents, and parents reinforcing at home. So it's not, Sunday school is not it. All those other things are it. And Ellen, I've talked a lot. And
No,
it's your
that's
turn.
okay. Yeah. No, I, of course, would second all of that. And I think, you know, on the side of the ways in which the theology that we'll talk about today can support good theories of parenting and families and raising children is that there are a lot of books and websites and lectures and all kinds of things out there on parenting strategies, parenting techniques, parenting scripts. You know, have this toolbox for your parenting. And believe me, I teach many of those things as well. But without a kind of a grounding reason to do those things that sort of makes sense, I think those are very difficult to sustain. And then what happens when it doesn't work? Then you feel like you are doing something wrong, or there's some mystery tool out there that you just don't have. And I experience that all of the time with families coming to me, oftentimes in a sort of, can you fix them sort of way, or where is, you know, and I will say, I don't have the magic wand. There is no magic wand. There is no magic technique. And so Bless This Mess is really much more based in good science and theory of not just child development, but all of human development. And good theory of human development just so happens to fit perfectly with what I would argue is good theology. So
It's not an accident, right?
no.
Little Easter eggs that God left for us. We think we're discovering something, but God created it at the beginning. So that's a good segue to our next slide, which is the Holy Trinity of Parenting. Ellen, what's the Holy Trinity of Parenting?
So I mentioned the sort of theory on which much of the book is based, or the theory of parenting. The theory of parenting comes from a much broader theory of all human development, which is called self-determination theory. And the sort of key concept of self-determination theory is autonomy support. It's based on the idea that all human beings, not just children, have a need to master our environments. And I am a little hesitant almost to use the word master, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, because mastery can start to feel like control, and control can start to feel like controllingness or power grabbing, and the lines can get blurry, so we'll talk about that. But again, it's a need to master our own universe, not other people's. It's to feel competent. It's a need to feel competent in the world, a need to feel like, I know if I do A, then B sort of happens. And we see this in the earliest stages of babies when they start, you know, the grasping and reaching for things. Can I pull my toes into my mouth? Can I make those little cute things come up to my mouth and nibble on them? And
First by accident and then by design,
well,
right?
Yeah, exactly. Well, and many things, of course, do happen by accident, and then they're happy discoveries, and then we realize that they're useful to us in some way. But that's, of course, how we evolved, and so we're still evolving on an individual level. And so the need for autonomy is a need to feel in control of one's own actions and one's own choices and one's own destiny to some extent. And so that's sort of perhaps the most critical leg of the stool, but a one-legged stool would not hold very well. And so there are two other concepts that we talk about. One is structure, which we sort of think of as the swaddle. It's sort of the information that we need to be explorers in our world. So there are certain limits of the natural universe and of our environment, and it's helpful to know what those are. It's helpful to have some anticipation or knowledge of what might happen next. And so that's really how I think of structure, as the kind of information to know at least some boundaries around our actions. And then the third leg, because also a two-legged stool is not so sturdy, is involvement. And that one can get really tricky in the field of parenting because you've probably heard that there's such a thing as too much involvement. We have over-involved parents. I'm not a fan of that term. I think we can be too controlling, which is the opposite dimension of being autonomy supportive. But I don't really think it's possible to be too involved in our children's lives. Not the way that we think about involvement, which is really knowledge. It's knowledge of your child, knowledge of their interests, knowledge of the world around them, their teachers, their friends, what they're doing. And it doesn't actually have anything to do with the amount of time spent with them. It's nothing to do at all with FaceTime. It is really the knowing. And so those are kind of the three core tenets of self-determination theory. And as Molly and I started talking about these, sort of realized that there's very much a theological or spiritual dimension to each of these. And so maybe Molly can talk a little bit about that.
And before I give an example of how that Holy Trinity of parenting was working from the very beginning of our sacred texts, because we're a small enough group, if anything we say is confusing or you want a little more information, just shoot your hand up and we'll answer questions on the fly or expand a little more. So I was thinking about this autonomy, support, structure, and involvement. And I thought of God, who was, after all, the first parent, right? What a risk to take to be the first parent. And the Garden of Eden story. God created Adam and Eve to be the first humans. And what did God do? God gave them a little bit of structure. God said, okay, here's this awesome place. Here's how it's going to work. Here are the limits. Here, if you choose this, this is going to happen. If you eat from the tree in the center of the garden, what's going to happen? Come on, people. There's at least a couple of ministers in this crowd. What did God say would happen if they ate from that tree? Of this tree you must not eat. If you do, you will die, right? But of any other tree in the garden you may eat. Then God took off. Not so involved. And what did Adam and Eve do? Almost immediately. Ate of the tree they weren't supposed to eat of. Now, they did not die, and that was God's first mistake. You always follow through on a threat. Every parent knows this. But God gave them room to make mistakes. God allowed them to make their own choices and to have free will and to even choose wrongly. And then God, whether God knew all along that she wasn't going to follow through on that threat or just decided, it's a lot of work making these two, maybe I can just, keep them growing and learning. God showed up.
I'll add another piece to that, which is, I think you've mentioned as well, that, Adam and Eve were curious. They were inquisitive.
So it's God's fault because God made them.
They wanted to master this environment. They wanted to see what would happen if we do this or go here or look at that or eat that. Who does that sound like? But every child ever.
Exactly. We are meant to be curious. It is a positive spiritual attribute. And the longer we can retain our curiosity in life, the better off we are. God was involved. God came back, and they hid from God as if you can hide from God. And God did have a talk with them. But God then gave them gifts. God expanded their world. That world was more uncomfortable. This is a rite of passage right now. They're moving toward adulting. They have greater autonomy and greater risks, but God sends them out with gifts. God gives them comfortable clothing in the place of the fig leaves. So you see God kind of working on keeping all three of those legs under the stool of equal length, as much as God can with us ornery humans.
And we never can, and God never can, and we never can either have all three legs of the stool exactly equal. That's just what we're aiming for or striving for. And if we're aiming and striving, that's good enough.
So, covered that. I guess the other piece is we talked about autonomy support as being a support of free will, a God-given gift, the swaddle as the set of choices we have, but also the limitations we have. You know, kids and adults, frankly, need sometimes we all need a little swaddle. We need to be held tightly. We need a strong container. We'll talk about this a little bit more later, but I think that's what we're seeing with the rise of re-rise or just loudness of fundamentalist Christianity. You know, these religions or practices of Christianity that are very much like you're in or you're out. Here are the rules. Who's saved? Who's preferred by God?
I think another way to think of structure and boundaries too is providing a sense of safety, because we can't explore or take adventures if we don't at the same time feel fundamentally safe. And I think that also fits in with sort of that is what knowing that there is some force or power in the universe bigger than us can feel overwhelming, but I think it can also feel, for people of faith, at least it has for me, been a sense of safety to know it's not all about me. I'm not in control. It's not the literal end of the world if I don't do this or do that wrong. We need to feel safe in that way to be able to explore and adventure, and our kids do too.
And the last piece I want to say about involvement is, you know, we all long to be close to our kids, the children in our lives, and for them to know that we are there for them when it really matters. The same is true of God. God longs to be close to us. And there are times in our lives when we feel God is very far away. And it's like, you know, it's Romans, you know, where can I go? Or also Psalm 39, where can I go? Where can I flee from you? I can't, God. If I take the wings of morning and fly to the deepest, to the other part of the sea, you're there with me. So even when we feel God is not with us, God is with us, and God longs to be involved in our lives. God wants that FaceTime too.
When my oldest graduated from high school this past spring, and his principal, when he was giving the graduation speech, said that he would always tell his own teenage girls to please remember that he and their mom were always their best option. And I think that's a really good example of involvement, whether you know everything or don't know everything. We have kind of a little bit of a irony in my own family where that same oldest, he's a close to the chest kind of guy. He doesn't like to share a whole lot, which is ironic because I tell him all the time, other 18-year-olds tell me everything. But I don't necessarily need to know everything, but he needs to know that I am always his best option. He needs to know that I am always there, wanting to know about him, wanting to know about his life, curious about it, excited about it with him, and supporting him in the choices that he makes and here for when they go wrong.
Ellen, tell about, so Luke just went off to college in Colorado, Boulder, Colorado, which was a blow, I know, to you, that he followed his dream there. And tell the brief conversation you had when you were saying goodbye and talking about how often you might keep in touch.
Oh, yeah, that's actually a funny one. I said, you know, thinking in my mind to when I was in college and the weekly, you know, Sunday night phone call, you know, everybody or people lining up at the phone. And so I said, you know, when would you like us to call? Like, when would you like us to be in touch? And his first response was, well, probably in the afternoons when I'm walking between classes would be the best time. And I was like, oh, he didn't totally understand my question, but totally makes sense because he's also a kid who mostly will talk when he's on the move. So it's great that you have these little like free rentals of the electric assist bikes, and it has a little hold for the phone. So a couple times I've gotten a phone call while he's riding a bike, which is great because he talks a lot and a little harrowing
helmet.
Because no, he's not wearing a helmet, and I'm thinking, you know, oh God, just don't crash. So, okay, afternoons, great. And then I said, well, how many times a week or how often would be too much? He said, well, don't FaceTime me more than like once a day.
And she was so excited.
I
She's
can
like,
do that.
I can talk to him every day. It's so
Okay.
great. So there, he left, but that gave him the space to connect more,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And that's often how autonomy works. If you give them the space, they can draw nearer.
And one thing I've since learned, if anyone has or will have college-age children, is that, especially when you work with people who have had college-age children, no one bats an eye when they call and you're like, I have to take this. I have to answer the call right now because it either could be an emergency or I won't hear from him again for 2 weeks. So, I have to take this right now.
We're ready for the next slide. So another kind of foundational principle of the book is based on a proverb in the book of Proverbs. Now, when you think of a proverb about parenting, you probably will think of spare the rod and, which is in our Bible. So that's a problem because instinctively, intuitively, we know that like beating our children is wrong. Some of us probably grew up and were spanked. That was sort of a normative part of parenting. I was spanked a few times, certainly not excessively. And I, as a young parent, really had struggled with my own anger toward my really challenging child and put myself in therapy. I wrote about it in the book with his permission. But while I was contending with my own anger and impulse to get physical, I knew it was wrong. This is a different proverb. It's Proverb 22, and it says, it's often mistranslated as, lead your child in the right way, and when they grow, they will not stray. Like meaning sort of lay down the law, tell them how it's going to be, and then they're going to be just like you. They're going to turn out exactly like how you want. Now, anyone who has raised children know it doesn't work that way. I mean, you can, if you were raised in a really authoritarian parenting culture, you can actually gain a lot of compliance from your child with authoritarian behavior, but you're going to gut your child in the process. They may rebel, or they may just get hollowed out. They won't, not having that autonomy support, not ever having choices to make themselves, they won't be able to trust their choices when they're older, because they will never have had to make choices.
Yeah, or they won't own them as their own choices. You will get obedience, you may get compliance in the moment, but you're much less likely to get what we talk about in psychology as an internalization of the actual values that drive the behavior you want them to comply with or to show or obey. And both those proverbs, I think, even spare the rod, spoil the child is still used in many faith traditions much more broadly, basically to say if you don't discipline in some way, then your child will stray.
Yeah. There's another proverb that says if you don't discipline your child, you don't love them. I mean, it's really not what we know to be true, healthy, helpful. Actually, kids who are abused or just become victimized by authoritarian parenting, if they don't become rebellious, can become very depressed. So something to keep in mind. We all know that intuitively, instinctively. What is the real theology we're aiming for? A better translation of Proverbs 22 is raise the child in their own way. That's a more accurate translation of the Hebrew. And when older, they will not, they will not depart from it. They will not depart from it. Raise your child to know who they are. Learn who your child is. Be curious about them. One of my spiritual teachers described this particular proverb to me as learn your child's grain, almost as if they're a really interesting piece of wood and you're a woodworker. Like you're kind of trying to see what's there. You don't want to cut against the grain or you'll splinter and ruin the wood. That metaphor, I think, has its limitations because it says, like, we're the woodworker, we're paring things away, and I don't really think we're doing that. We're just in a process of discovery with our child, alongside our child, to understand what motivates them, what scares them. There's a concept in child psychology of temperament.
Yeah, I think that's really what we're talking about here. I will often say it absolves parents of a lot of guilt and shame, too. I always tell parents, they come the way they come. I mean, if anyone who's had more than one child, mine were different the first night in the hospital. I hadn't done anything yet. So that's really this concept of temperament, which we talk about much more extensively in the book. But I would actually push back a little, Mal, and say I think that the wood carver analogy does work, because I think I'm sort of listening to us talk and wondering if anybody is having the kind of typical reaction, which is, well, then what are we supposed to do? Just let them do whatever they want? And that's where we come back to the three-legged stool, that no, we still are providing that involvement, that knowing what's going on, and that structure, that information. Because God created the tree. Yes. Yes, yes. And you don't want to fight against its natural tendencies. And that's really what we mean when we say raise them in their own way. What are their interests? What are their passions? Where is their own little self and bigger self taking them? And to the extent possible, our job is to follow them there and tell them what's important to us, what we value. It's okay to tell them what we hope for in terms of where they will end up. But one thing we can't do is we can't write their stories for them. And we definitely don't know the ending. We can't plan for that.
Can't look ahead in the book and see how it ends. That's the hardest part for me, especially I have two children. One's 16, she's a girl, 20, and a boy. The 20-year-old is much more impulsive, a little less so now that his prefrontal cortex is finally starting to form, but had to learn everything the hard way, every single thing. I could tell him how things would turn out if X then Y, never wore his bike helmet, just lots of risky behavior, always wanted more, always wanted to see PG-13 movies if I only wanted to see G, R if he, stayed up late watching The Walking Dead in 7th grade, like the most terrifying, gory, disgusting thing possible, unbeknownst to me, obliviously sleeping upstairs.
He wanted to eat the apple and see if he would die.
He did, and he kept not dying.
Right.
I kind of wanted him to almost die once or twice, just to put the fear of God in him.
But every time Mal would call, she would call.
That's what I was about to say. I'd call and I'd be like, but Ellen, he's doing X, Y, and Z. And she's like, he's very consistent. You know exactly who he is.
He needs to try it out for himself. He is not going to take your word. He is never going to take your word for it.
Never.
He's got to try it for himself.
Yeah. And thank goodness his sister is not like that, or it might have killed me. But
it also speaks to this importance of structure, which is different from discipline, and it is a little different, maybe better than the way that God did it. You don't want to tell them that this thing is going to kill them if it's not, because some things might kill them. And so there are some things you don't ever want them to try to figure out what might happen.
fentanyl.
Yeah, literally. And we've both had that those conversations with our kids. And it's still not a guarantee that they won't try those things. But hopefully we are trustworthy sources of that information, because as I say to my own kids and all of the kids that I work with, I will never lie to you. I will never knowingly lie to you, because that is one thing that we can really do to undermine our own parenting of our own or other people's children.
And I think another piece of that, and this is involvement, is if we say, you can tell me anything, you can call me anytime, anywhere, for any reason, and get a ride, no questions asked, we really have to mean that.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously we're talking teens now, but then we can't go back on that if that's the promise we make them.
Yep. We'll read at the end Khalil Gibran's poem together, but there's one line of the poem along these sentiments, which is you can give your children your love, but not your thoughts. They have their own thoughts. And so that's really that involvement, the information, and ultimately it's up to them to decide what to do with that.
And surprisingly, if we give them a little bit of freedom and we give them respect as they're becoming, we observe them, we may find that they land kind of closer to our values than we might have imagined. And Ellen's going to read us a bit from the book about an encounter with her kid.
I forgot my reading glasses. Sorry about that. Okay, perfect. Thank you. So we will shock no one by telling you that both of us up here were uber nerds. Good students who worked hard without anyone telling us to, and who always did the extra credit, even though we rarely needed it. Our boys, not so much. When my Luke started getting actual letter grades in the 6th grade, his first progress report was straight C's. I wasn't observing much effort at home, and the grades were simply proof that it wasn't enough. So together with my husband, we calmly strategized a plan to talk to Luke, emphasizing the value of effort. Why effort? Because our family values education as a means of keeping all future options for a life path open. The plan was to come alongside involvement rather than at Luke and figure out a strategy that would result in Luke working harder, autonomy support. At dinner one night, I took the approach I advise parents to take all of the time: notice and comment on what you're seeing without a lot of emotion or judgment to begin the conversation. So I started by taking Luke's perspective. We know this is the first time you have ever gotten actual letter grades, so maybe you were surprised too, like us, that you have all C's. Then Luke threw the first curveball. He's really good at that, by the way, still. Well, little, but Mom, a C is average. So I was the girl who always did the extra credit, even when I already had an A+, so I was pretty speechless. My husband, who had spent more time in middle school meticulously editing report card grades than earning them, stepped in, communicating the family value of effort in education that we had planned on. Co-parenting often looks a lot like a relay. Remember, it's okay to tag out when your kids leave you stumbling. It turned out that dinner conversation was just the first of many. Conflict that pokes at fundamental values rarely resolves with one talk. I had fallen into the trap of thinking this argument could be resolved by simply explaining to Luke where he had gone wrong and how to make it right. But Luke is going to grow up with his own set of values. They are shaped by us, but forged on his own so that they are truly his, not simply behavior that follows the rules or expectations when he's being graded by his teachers or by us. There have been a lot of conversations since then, mostly, if not always, guided by the Holy Trinity of parenting. First, involvement. I had assumed Luke would be the student I had been, whose parents didn't need to ask if homework was completed. I had been trying not to be a white-knuckled helicopter parent. The couple of times I had tried to help with writing, it was way too tempting to shape Luke's words into something that wasn't his voice, but mine. But I had stepped back so far that I had no idea he wasn't doing assignments. A little digging revealed Luke was also struggling. Meanwhile, my husband had assumed I would handle the school thing, since that was my strength. What we discovered, renegotiated, was that he was actually the one better equipped to understand where Luke was coming from. Second, autonomy support. Luke had the opportunity to retake a quiz he had not studied for and, surprise, had done poorly on. When I prompted him to study, the master of curveballs replied that he had no intention of retaking the quiz. He explained that it had been a stupid quiz on classroom policies. He had lost points for not knowing the teacher's email address, something he pointed out would auto-populate if he needed to email her anyway. Why did he need to know that? It had nothing to do with science or the education that was a family value. Good point. But for me, this was again about the value of effort. Luke noted that he valued being able to have lunch with his friends over spending the period retaking the quiz. For him, this was about the value of time with people he cared about. While I could see his point, I also knew Luke had sacrificed the time needed to study for the original quiz to watch YouTube videos. So I gave him a choice and the structure of knowing what would happen depending upon what he chose. Luke could spend a half hour studying and retake the quiz the next day, or he could turn in his cell phone and all screens for the rest of that evening and the next for FaceTime with his parents and little brother. Luke needed no time to think to make his choice and immediately handed over his phone. At first, I thought I had failed. Where had I gone wrong? I went back to Luke 10 minutes later, feeling I needed to be honest. I just need you to know that I was hoping you would make a different choice. Luke responded, I know, but you told me it was my choice. Right. The conflict was about the relative values between academics, time with friends or family, and time on screens. Luke had chosen family over YouTube and friends over what to him was a meaningless grade. Not the choice I was hoping for, but still one in line with my values, if in a different way. Here's the hardest and arguably the best part. The conflict over education, hard work, earning grades, going to a good college, and getting a good job is a conflict of values. Allowing Luke the opportunity to consider, decide, and express his own values has forced me to re-examine my own. The amazing thing is that Luke's decisions, in many ways, are a truer expression of the values I was claiming to hold than straight A's would be.
Amen. Say amen if you've been there. So we're on to the next slide. And, we can know with our prefrontal cortexes about the holy trinity of parenting, and that to try to reach for too much control is to become controlling, and that's not good for our kids or ourselves or our relationship with our kids. But we're not making the decision to be controlling with this part of our brain. We're making it with our reptilian brain. We're making it with a fearful brain of what is going to happen to them if they don't make all the right choices, all the choices we would make that we have with the wisdom of age. So we have to deal with our fear. And there's a reason the Bible says in so many places, be not afraid. That's what the angels always say when they show up. It's there countless times. Of course, saying be not afraid doesn't make you unafraid. So how do you practice opening your grasp? How do you practice letting go? I thought of a story when we were talking about autonomy support and getting to know our children's brain, and I'm going to tell on myself this story. Our kid Rafe was really smart and great at school till 5th grade, and then started to fail everything starting in 6th grade, and was just couldn't sit still and wouldn't do homework and hated homework and got super annoying during homework time, and classic signs of ADD that I completely missed because I was not attending to him. I was not looking to learn his brain. I was trying to put him into my box of how I had been a student, and I thought he was just being annoying because he was a boy, No offense against the boys in the room, but I was raised mostly with sisters. It wasn't until middle of 8th grade that he was mature enough and aware enough of himself that he asked for testing, and we did it, and he was off the charts ADD, and then we could deal with that. And it's taken him years and a lot of parental guilt to help him figure out his brain. He's finally getting there. He's doing a lot better, but so simply observing can help us begin to let go of fear, right? We were talking we were with friends last night. We did a little mini concert online and talking about how just pulling your attention to the present can help you be less afraid. Noticing what's before you. It's a classic strategy when you're having a panic attack. 5 things you can see, 4 things you can hear. We can do the same with our kids if we can really be in the moment with them, see them as they actually are without our fears and projections. We can start to open the hand a little bit.
And without our fears and anxieties for the future, because that's really what drives more controlling behavior. When we feel like we are out of control, we tend to become controlling. And that's not just in parenting. I think we're seeing that on a much larger scale right now, and on a larger scale of parenting. We talk about that in the book as well, that now we're a couple of generations into kids who are not expected to do better than their parents did financially or in terms of status or whatever you want to say. And with status comes security, right? Status is less for most of us, less about status and more about security. So it's understandable that we're fearful, we're anxious. Many things feel very much out of our control right now. And so even when, there's a lot of pitfalls to this, though. We can become more controlling, and it doesn't serve our own children well. It also doesn't serve other children well. When we get in that mindset, it's a scarcity mindset of there's probably not enough of whatever, teacher attention, sports scholarships, whatever it is to go around. So where we can start to kind of hoard resources for our own children at the expense of others if we're not careful.
Privatizing, moving public school funds into private schools, which benefits people who can afford that, right? Who can afford to make up the difference, take a voucher somewhere else. And I think on the left and right, this kind of controlling parenting looks very different. I think we're seeing a lot of it in the public realm as far as what's taught in schools and second-guessing teachers and firing teachers in terms of, critical race theory and how our history is taught, how truthfully the fullness of our history is taught, the history of slavery in this country, and in terms of all the panic around gender and sexuality.
And it's really doing our kids a disservice because we're basically giving them the message that we don't trust them to have the information and make the choices for themselves. And it's doing us a disservice too, because if you feel so out of control that you can't tell your child what you think, what sort of message is that sending? It's okay to disagree, to say, I actually don't agree with that thing that you learned about in school. And if that's your family value, it's very important to communicate that. But if you're sort of trying to forbid them from even knowing, it is a little bit falling back to, you will die. If you eat the apple, you will die.
Yeah.
Well,
The apple
let's
of
give them
knowledge.
some accurate information so that they can make their own informed decisions that will be informed by the values that we are modeling for them and teaching them.
We talk about moral development in the book and how a really immature stage of moral development is binary black and white thinking. You have a 2-year-old, a 3-year-old, like early verbal, who always wants to know who's the good guy and who's the bad guy. And that's their attempt to make their world safer, right? If I can recognize who's not a safe person, I can keep myself safer. So that's an absolutely necessary stage of moral development. But by age 6, 7, 8,
Even younger to
with
some
some
extent.
kids, you start to see them outgrowing that, becoming a little more nuanced. And of course, we show up at church with all kinds of people and all kinds of behaviors. And, there are behaviors that are scary or strange or destructive. And we try to, name the behavior, not the person. We don't demonize or dehumanize the person. All people are welcome, but not all behaviors are welcome. And they start to understand nuance about that. Unfortunately, some of us get well into adulthood and don't really outgrow that first stage of moral thinking. We always want to name who are the good guys and who are the bad guys. And we can regress to that kind of thinking as well, which, again, I think we're seeing a lot in the public realm.
We can go too far in modeling it for our kids, too. A lot of one strike, you're out policies just don't give kids room to grow. And people need room to grow. So I think I suggested maybe Molly read something from the new book that's actually along those lines.
And of course, we say in the UCC that God is still speaking. We believe in a God of grace. We believe in a God who calls us to repentance and renewal, a God of infinite second chances. So how do we live that God out loud? This is not about children, it's about adults, but I think it illustrates something important about how we are in our life together, how we model for our children, that continual becoming. This is from a chapter called The Superpower of Vulnerability, and I've served 3 churches now as an ordained person, and I'm going to skip it. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but essentially in my first church, this is staying in the room, right? Oh, and on the internet. Well, it's in black and white. It's there, black and white. There you go, black and white thinking. It was a little bit more conservative suburban church north of Boston. And, well, I'll just read you. The consequence of not being able to show all of your parts to at least one other human, your abject fears, your addictions, your disordered desires, your compulsive thoughts, your legitimate emotional or physical or sexual needs, and more, is a bifurcation of the soul. My church in Somerville had a lot of practice in loving people, not just when, but because they showed up whole, integrated, and messy with all of their pieces and parts they were still figuring out on display. A while ago, I wrote a book about First Church Somerville's long-standing practice of putting a different layperson on the mic each week to confess their sins in worship. This is not as scandalous as it sounds. Mostly what people confess to is garden variety selfishness, myopia, jealousy, or cowardice. But importantly, it's an exercise in vulnerability, in showing each other our wounds and our weakness so we can be whole and wholehearted together. When I was their pastor, I noticed that at this urban church rife with people struggling with substance abuse, mental health crises, debt, and poverty, people were more well than the fine-looking folks I had known in suburban churches I'd served. I believe it had everything to do with our culture of offering confession and then receiving grace from the embodied Christ manifest in the people in the pews, their peers. We preached that grace and we practiced it. We were a living reminder that the fully human, fully divine rabbi we followed was vulnerable every step of the way. He was born into poverty and barely escaped infanticide. He died young by state violence, and even when he was resurrected, he rose with his wounds. In the white upper-middle-class suburban church where I served before First Church Somerville, in a bedroom community north of Boston with Puritan roots, there was a strong taboo against airing your dirty laundry at church. If people divorced, they disappeared. If their difficult children grew into wayward teens, they likewise faded away rather than go to their spiritual community for support. When people from my congregation found themselves going off the rails in one way or another, they were sometimes shunned and only spoken about in whispers. Since it's easier for me to love an underdog, I was naturally drawn to them. And then I go on to describe two people who committed fairly horrific crimes and went to prison for their crimes, and how I stayed in touch with them while they were in prison, and what they taught me about grace and becoming and coming to terms with the worst thing they'd ever done, but also coming to terms with the fact that they were more than the worst thing they'd ever done. And I just want to read one last thought. I think often about Mike and Gloria, their humility, their gratitude, their willingness to talk about what really matters. They are so clear on what their spiritual work is, and that the worst thing they had ever done has nonetheless brought them into deep communion with God and other vulnerable souls for mutual healing. Here's what I keep thinking. What if church was a safe enough place for Mike to tell someone about his urges before he ever acted on them? What if there had been less of a taboo in faith communities on getting mental health support or talking about partner violence before it came to a crisis for Gloria? I'll leave it there. If we can come to church messy, if our kids can come to us messy, if we can be really vulnerable with other human beings, understanding that God loves us just as we are, and as Anne Lamott says, loves us too much to let us stay that way, we can keep becoming, and we can avoid doing harm to ourselves and each other. So should we go to, are we on to the last slide?
I think we are.
Okay, good, because it's 3 minutes of 3, and we want to leave time for some questions and conversation. So the next slide.
I'm going to hearken back to your sermon a bit.
Sure.
That God has no grandchildren.
Yes. I'll just read this. It's a little hard to see. When we pressure and privilege our own kids out of inherent anxiety about their futures, we risk leaving other people's kids behind, perpetuating the same inequalities we are trying to teach our kids to change. This morning in the sermon, I said, God has no grandchildren. We're all equally beloved children of God. And I also said there's no such thing as other people's children. I mean, there's the unique children we were given to clothe and feed and house. But of course, there are many other children who don't have the resources many other parents who don't have the resources that we do, kids born into really difficult traumatic circumstances, kids with disabilities, and how do we live into that theological truth that God has given us to belong to one another, and we are responsible for one another.
We didn't put this in the notes, but it is reminding me that we do talk in the book too about downward mobility. And, you know, I said before that we get anxious from a scarcity mindset and that there might not be enough to go around for our children and all the other children. And the hard truth is there might not. It sort of depends on what you define as enough. There are limits to the resources we have to give. And it can be a real challenge and exercise for us to work through our own fears and anxieties, because it feels like we're putting our own children at risk of missing out or losing if we